when you want me to speak, Lori, right? When
Yeah.
since I'm the opening.
We're on, we're live. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Hello, and welcome to the Iowa Freedom Summit, recognizing Slavery and Human Trafficking Prevention Month, and sponsored by the Iowa Network Against Human Trafficking and Slavery and the Clinton Franciscan Peace Center. I'm Lori Freudenberg, Community Outreach Director at the Franciscan Peace Center, the network board member, and your moderator today. I am thrilled that you've joined us to learn more about human trafficking and how it happens right here in Iowa. We have 6 esteemed panelists who are also members of the network board and who are eager to share their expertise and experiences working with trafficking survivors, identifying the red flags indicating a possible trafficking victim, and what you can do to help protect others from becoming victims, because it is the responsibility of each of us. I invite you to post any questions for our panelists in the chat box, and we will hopefully ask them at the very end. Also in the chat box is information about upcoming events that I will mention later. So let's get started. Our first panelist today is former Iowa Senator, former Scott County Supervisor, also the first woman supervisor, and founder of Braking Traffik, Maggie Tinsman, who will give an overview of human trafficking. Maggie?
Thank you very much, Lori. First, I wish to refresh our understanding about how human trafficking affects us in Iowa. Human trafficking is a form of modern-day slavery involving victims who are forced, defrauded, or coerced into labor or sexual exploitation. According to the National Human Trafficking Hotline statistics, 5,147 human trafficking cases were reported between January 1st of 2018 and June 30th of 2018. 4,233 female victims and 629 male victims, and 38 gender minority victims and 247 unknown gender victims. Also, there were 3,718 sex trafficking and 602 labor trafficking, 310 sex and labor trafficking, and 517 trafficking type unknown cases. In fact, COVID-19 has resulted in a global increase in the number of vulnerable people who fall victim to traffickers. This pandemic has placed more school-age children online for hours per week, and predators are taking advantage of this situation. Some say that 55% of Iowa's sex trafficking victims are young women and girls under the age of 18. I believe that this percentage is low, not 55%. The number might be 80%, as the average age in Iowa is 15 years old. Moreover, human trafficking is the fastest growing sector of organized crime worldwide. It's highly profitable and largely undercover. In fact, traffickers who average $250,000 per victim are hard to identify, and only 3% are ever prosecuted. Drugs are behind the control of most traffickers, as they use drugs to hook the victim on drugs or support their victim's current habit. Runaway, homeless, and abused teens, often in their own homes, are perfect targets for online grooming due to their vulnerability and inexperience. Teens in Iowa's foster care system, as well as any female on drugs, are also at high risk for being trafficked. The pimp becomes the boyfriend. Now, the top 5 venues for sex trafficking are illicit massage parlors and spas, resident-based commercial sex, hotels and motels, pornography, and online ads. Now, labor trafficking is the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for labor or services through the use of force, fraud, or coercion for the purpose of subjecting to involuntary servitude, debt bondage, peonage, or slavery. And the top 5 venues for labor trafficking are domestic work, traveling sales crews, agriculture, restaurant, food services, and begging rings. So labor trafficking has occurred in Iowa at Postville meatpacking plant, the DeCoster egg farms, and Henry turkey farm. This kind of activity continues to grow around the world, where there are more slaves today in the world than have ever existed in the world. And it is here in Iowa.
Thank you, Maggie. We will see her again as our last presenter when she'll talk about legislation against human trafficking in Iowa. Our next panelist is Elise Harden, Survivor Services Supervisor at Family Resources, overseeing the Braking Traffik program in both Iowa and Illinois Quad Cities. She will present the warning signs and red flags associated with human trafficking and provide information on the importance of connecting a survivor to services.
Thanks, Lori. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. I'll be talking to you guys about the red flags, indicators, and the importance of survivor services. So who is at risk? A person who is affected by human trafficking can be anybody, women, men, children, youth, those foreign to a nation, and our country's own citizens. A person who's been trafficked likely lived a life with compounding vulnerabilities, such as traumas, abuse, disability, violence, family breakdown, homelessness, poverty, or a combination of many factors. And some of the other vulnerability factors can include age, history of abuse, most especially sexual abuse, special needs, cognitive disabilities, substance use, poverty, runaway behavior and homelessness, history of involvement in child protective services, those identifying as LGBTQ, gang involvement, unsafe use of the internet and social media, and unaccompanied minors. Though cultural norms and values differ worldwide, the need to be loved and the desire to provide for one's family are common to us all. Traffickers exploit vulnerabilities that many people already face by using stories of a better life, whether that means a feeling of belonging, a better income, or a chance for new opportunities. So before I get into the red flags and indicators, it's important that you guys know that the signs of human trafficking vary from situation to situation. No one single sign or indicator can be used to clearly identify a trafficking situation, but if you see multiple signs, red flags, or indicators, the probability that someone is being trafficked increases. So red flags to consider include when looking at the common work and living conditions. They may not be free to leave or come and go as he or she pleases. They may be in the commercial sex industry and have a pimp or a manager. They may be unpaid, paid very little, or paid only through tips. They work excessively long or unusual hours. They may not be allowed breaks, or they may suffer from unusual restrictions at work. They may owe a large debt and is unable to pay that off. They may be recruited through false promises concerning the nature and conditions of their work. And there may be high security measures that exist at their work or in their living location, such as boarded up windows, bars on the windows, barbed wire, security cameras. When it comes to mental health and exhibiting abnormal behaviors, they may be fearful, anxious, depressed, submissive, tense, or nervous. They may have suicidal thoughts, or they may be self-harming themselves. They may be experiencing an eating disorder or be engaging in substance use or abuse. They may exhibit unusually fearful or anxious behavior, especially when bringing up law enforcement, and they may avoid eye contact. When it comes to physical health, they may lack medical care and or be denied their medical services by their employer. They may appear malnourished or show signs of repeated exposure to harmful chemicals, especially in the labor trafficking situations. They may show signs of physical or sexual abuse, physical restraint, confinement, or torture. They may not have control of many things. This could include not having control of their personal possessions or having very few control of their personal possessions. They may not be in control of their own money, their own financial records, or their own bank account. And they may not be in control of their own identification documents, such as a state ID or a passport. And they may not be allowed to speak for themselves. If there's a third party with them, they may insist on having that third party be present and or translating, because that is what they are forced to do. And that's why it's really important that if there is a third party present, that you separate this potential survivor or victim from that third party. Some other red flags to consider include maybe that they're claiming that they're just visiting, and they might have the inability to clarify where they're staying or what their address is. That's a huge red flag. They may have a lack of knowledge of where their whereabouts and or the city that they're in. They may have a loss of sense of time, and they may have numerous inconsistencies within their story. And they may appear coached, because that's what traffickers often do. Some red flags specific to minors include, maybe they're being accompanied by a non-guardian, an older adult, or unrelated adults. They may have access to material possessions that you don't think they would typically be able to afford as a minor. They may be overfamiliar with sexual terms and practices, and seemingly have excessive number of sexual partners. For example, if the child is 11 years old and has had 20 sexual partners, that's obviously a red flag. They may have a history of school truancy or running away. Perhaps maybe they're not attending school for a short period of time, but then they return again. The same goes as being in the home. Maybe they're missing and then they come and go. When they do return, they may be hungry or tired. And usually these minors are not reported as missing. Minors might be reluctant to talk about any specific tattoos or brandings that they've gotten. And a red flag is also the fearful attachment to their cell phone or having several cell phones. Some important considerations in responding: if you guys recognize these indicators or red flags, it's important to note that success is not getting a survivor out of a trafficking situation. More than likely, you won't get a disclosure. Success is leaving a positive impression on that survivor and them knowing that you or your agency is a safe place to turn to for help when they are ready. Individuals who are experiencing trafficking may not be ready to leave that situation, and it may not be safe for them to do so. It's important that you treat them as the experts of their situations, because they are the experts of their situation. Be supportive of their decisions and make appropriate referrals to your local victim service provider. And it's important to note that individuals under the age of 18 do not have to prove force, fraud, or coercion, because as minors, they are unable to consent to commercial sex. Minors engaging in survival sex are automatically considered trafficking victims, and survival sex is anyone engaging in sexual acts in exchange for a basic need to be met. So why connect a survivor to services? Obviously for help, but throughout the state of Iowa, we have several victim service providers that function on the same service delivery model. The service delivery model is survivor-centered and trauma-informed. There's advocates that are trained specially to provide services to survivors of human trafficking. This model also includes offering voluntary and free services, which means that that survivor gets to choose when they want the services or the help. It's not our jobs to dictate when they get help and how to get help. If they want to engage in services for only a week and then we don't see them again for a year and then they call us, they can re-engage in services at any time. All of our services are confidential, that we cannot share, legally we cannot share any information about that survivor unless we have written consent from that survivor. The trained advocates can respond 24/7 to police departments and hospital emergency rooms if there is a survivor identified. This can be initiated by calling the local victim service provider's crisis line, which is 24/7, or the statewide crisis line, which Jessica Rohrs will be talking about here shortly. To touch on that survivor-centered model, that means that we recognize that each survivor has a different set of needs, and there is no one-size-fits-all approach to working with the survivors. Our focus is the survivor's safety and the well-being of that survivor. They're the experts of their own circumstance, and they guide us to assist them with their healing process. This model also allows survivors to regain control of their lives by making their own choices in the services they want to receive, how they want to receive them, and how long they want to receive them. All of our advocates approach the survivors in a non-judgmental way, and of course, they are all trained to be trauma-informed. Advocates provide a wide variety of comprehensive services. Obviously, when they access services, or when a survivor accesses services for the first time, the advocate's goal is to help meet the survivor's basic needs, such as food, clothing, and shelter. Some of the crisis needs could also include legal advocacy and emergency medical care. Needs can be ongoing, and the services are also ongoing if the survivor wishes to continue services after the crisis situation has surpassed. Some of the ongoing needs can be healthcare needs, mental health care, substance abuse treatment or services, transitional housing, immigration advocacy, legal advocacy, or getting them engaged in language skills classes, job skill classes, or life skill classes. The needs vary per the situation and per what the survivor wants.
Thank you, Elise. Now we will hear from Jessica Rohrs, Director of Victim Services with Family Crisis Centers. She will present statewide resources for victims and survivors of labor and sex trafficking, how someone can access help, and the response one receives when they do reach out for help. Jessica?
All right, thank you everyone for joining us today. It's encouraging to see so many people active in this panel and participating and listening to this, because it truly is going to take all hands on deck to end trafficking. So many times I hear the question of what services are out there that can help me, and I want to dive into that question. So I'm going to start out with our Iowa Victim Service Call Center. Our Iowa Victim Service Call Center is funded through the Iowa Attorney General's office, and it's funded to serve all 99 counties in the state of Iowa. And we also serve all victims of violent crimes. So with that comes with serving victims and survivors of sex and labor trafficking. What's also nice about this encompassing all victims of violent crimes is that a lot of times victims may be identifying that they're a victim of domestic violence or sexual assault. And so that's helpful that our advocates are equipped and trained to serve them all. Our Iowa Victim Service Call Center is 24/7, 365 days a year. Our advocates are always available. There is always around 3 to 4 advocates in the office ready to answer phone calls, and it's free and confidential. And I include our 1-800 number as well as our 24/7 text line there for everyone to reference. This, our Iowa Victim Service Call Center, the reason why I give you all this resource first is because we're often referred to as a one-stop shop. And so if somebody were to call in, explain, you know, what kind of help they're looking for, explain what they're experiencing, we can really get them pointed in the right direction versus them having to call so many phone numbers in order to receive that help. A lot of times I also get the question of what is the difference between the Iowa Victim Service Call Center and the National Human Trafficking Hotline? And I just want to start out with saying they're both great resources. I would say mostly the biggest difference is going to be that the National Human Trafficking Hotline, I would encourage individuals to use this to report if they have a suspicion or if they feel as if it's necessary to make a report to law enforcement about red flags they're seeing in a situation. The National Human Trafficking Hotline has a procedure set up to contact law enforcement in the zip code that you're in which you are seeing this concern. The nice thing about the Iowa Victim Service Call Center is our advocates are living in Iowa. They're the majority of them are from Iowa, and so they really know the landscape. They know the demographics. They know just the really fine details of what a caller might be talking about when they're talking about the town they live in, or just different details about their situation. So our Iowa helpline is going to get kind of more detailed and really understand Iowa victims and survivors. So what will happen when someone calls? This is also a very important point. If you're working with a victim or survivor, many times they want to know this answer, as I would as well, just to know you can know what to expect. What will happen is an advocate will answer the phone saying, "Crisis line, how can I help you?" And really from there, a lot like Elise talked about, the caller is in the driver's seat. It's really important that we all understand that the victim or the survivor is expert in their own life. They know what decision is best for them in that moment, and it's really important that we respect that. Much like Elise said, success is them seeing you as a safe resource, because it might not be safe for them to reach out, but if you make them feel and tell them that you are a safe resource, maybe in 20 days from now, or maybe next year when they're looking for help, they're going to remember you as that safe resource, and they will reach out when that time is right for them. Like Elise said as well, I liked how she said they guide us to assist them in their journey. And so just remembering that, because if we as an outsider try to take the lead in their journey, we could actually put them in more danger. And so it's really, really important that we remember that part. So every call into the call center or into a victim service agency across the state of Iowa, help is going to look different for each individual. And that's also a really important point for us to remember. We all need to be survivor centered. We all need to really take the time to sit down with victims and survivors, understand what they're going through, and then really ask them what is their priority? What do you need the most help with today? And that really is where our resources dive into play. And the call center, the reason why I'm going to show you guys these maps is just to show you the different resources that are out there. And I realize you might not be able to see these, but the main point is that I really want everyone to understand that there are a lot of resources out there. And this is just the surface level. I mean, the list goes on and on. But what's really important is that we understand that victim and survivor's priority, so we can point them in the right direction as to which program is going to work best for them. So when somebody calls into the call center, if they want to be connected to a local program, we are going to connect them with a local program. Elise touched base on kind of what the services they would receive with these local programs. And it's really important to point out that, across the state, there's culturally specific programs, there's emergency shelter programs, there are restoration homes if somebody is looking for a long-term housing more so than the emergency shelter. And of course, the comprehensive services that can really help somebody support them through the criminal justice system, or maybe they're just looking somebody to talk to, every Monday afternoon. And so providing them an advocate who's available to do those things, or maybe it's hospital advocacy or whatnot. These programs can really help them navigate through that process. So really want to leave you guys with the point, the Iowa Victim Service Call Center is available 24/7, even if you're not a victim or survivor looking for help, but maybe you're a community member that has questions and you'd like to learn a little bit more, or you are a family member or friend supporting somebody through this difficult situation and want to call in for help as well. These resources are available to you as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica. Now, Dr. Shannon Findlay, member of the Johnson County Human Trafficking Coalition and the University of Iowa Hospital and Clinics Human Trafficking Committee, will present the one tenet of care for survivors, acknowledging individuals' autonomy on disclosure of their needs and situation. And she'll present information on mandatory reporting. Dr. Findlay?
All right, sorry there, I got myself unmuted. So, hi, I'm Shannon. I wanted to talk a little bit about mandatory reporting. This is often a question that comes up. And I think for a lot of us who are mandatory reporters, there can be a lot of anxiety around this question when we're faced with it. What do we report? When do we report it? And then I think for some people in the community, just the knowledge of who are mandatory reporters. So some of the goals of mandatory reporting, I think, is important to review. First and foremost, the goal is to stop abuse and harm from occurring or reoccurring in situations. And it does allow us an avenue where we can link people to resources that otherwise they may not have come in contact with. Kind of a third subcategory, which is important on the global understanding of abuses that are occurring in our community and nature-wide, is it does give us some data on what's happening. And with that data, we can get a better understanding of the funding that maybe is needed and policies that may need to be put in place. It's really important to remember that mandatory laws are state specific. So while there are guidelines that are kind of universal, the specific details do vary from state to state. Today, I'm going to focus mostly on Iowa because that's what I'm most familiar with, and I will kind of touch on some other points from Illinois to show a difference. When we have these situations of mandatory reporting, it's often a time for the individual that can be highly stressful, very sensitive, and a very personal situation. So when you're in these situations, you should use your trauma-informed lens. And Teresa Davidson will be talking more about trauma-informed care. But this is a time that you really want to make sure you're using all of those tools. Lastly, I think it's important to have a high index of suspicion. When we talk about human trafficking, we know that it can look so different from one situation to the next. And if we don't think about it, then we will certainly miss it. So who does mandatory reporting apply to? It applies to both minors and dependent adults. I think when we have the issue of human trafficking, it comes up a lot that people want to report it to somebody, even in adults. But that is not the case for adults. There is no mandatory report for adults. The only exceptions that come up potentially would be for some healthcare providers where here in the state of Iowa, if somebody's assaulted with a deadly weapon, for example, that is a mandatory report to police. So knowing your state-specific requirements and exceptions are important. But most importantly, you just need to remember that mandatory reporting applies to minors and dependent adults. So am I a mandatory reporter? For most of us, your job that you work in will kind of dictate this, whether or not you're a healthcare provider, you work in education, law enforcement, childcare, social work are the main categories across states. Again, check with your employer whether or not you're a mandatory reporter. And in that case, you will often have some designated learning requirements that go over the specifics for the mandatory reports in your state. For Iowa, looking particularly at child abuse laws, there is no labor trafficking mandatory report in the state of Iowa. However, you will see that included in this list of the 11 categories of child abuse, child sex trafficking is included. The important part about mandatory reporting as well is that for minors, the abuser or perpetrator is the caregiver. And so that's important in the context of what the situation looks like. The exception here, which is really important, is that for child sex trafficking, for those that are minors, there is no caregiver status required. And this comes up in a lot of different situations, and I'll kind of go through some scenarios at the end that highlight that. The other important piece when we look at the child sex trafficking law here in the state of Iowa, it also includes solicitation. So that does not mean, so it includes things that where the act of commercial sex acts have not even happened, but that they're being solicited for them. And so that can be easily missed when you're not looking for it. For Iowa, you have to have a report, an oral report within 24 hours, and then 48 hours for a written report. You can contact DHS, the Department of Human Services, at the number here. It's easy to look up online as well. Just to highlight kind of a difference with Illinois, since they're so close to us here in Iowa, is that in their child abuse laws, they do include labor or services into the definition of human trafficking. Unfortunately, I couldn't find any information on whether there are any caregiver exceptions for there is in Iowa with the child sex trafficking, and they also have a report immediately timeframe. So I just wanted to highlight that to show that things are different between our states. There's a lot of challenges to mandatory reporting that come up. I think first and foremost, one of the ones that often causes us a lot of anxiety is that the person that you're working with may not want you to share that information. And in doing so, you can really harm that relationship by breaking the trust. There also can be some unintentional harm that comes along because once you give that information and report it, you will no longer have control over that information yourself as the person, as the reporter, and then of course the individual whose information is being shared. And we're not always sure what consequences may come out of that. And then the other anxiety provoking part, I think, for a lot of people is that sometimes the situation is not obvious. Is this a form of abuse that's occurring? Sorry, the mailman just came. Is this a form of abuse that is occurring? So some guidelines I think that are really great to keep in mind are that whenever possible, notify the individual of your mandatory reporter status just prior to the disclosure if you can, or at the beginning of that discussion. It's not always possible that happens. So I work in healthcare, and unfortunately, sometimes you might be caught off guard that a conversation may go down a road where a disclosure is given. It's really important that after that happens, you let them know that you are a mandatory reporter and are legally required by law to give that information. Things that you can do to try to help in that situation is to try to give back some control to the individual that you're working with, and utilizing support systems that are in place, such as the services that we talked about, and advocates whenever possible. You can try to give them ways to help with the way the information is released, whether it's talking to other people in the hospital system or the services that you may be requesting, whether it's their parents for minors. All of those are ways that you can try to give some control back to the individual. So a couple scenarios that I just want to run through quickly, because I think this highlights for Iowa some of the mandatory reports that may come up. So you have a scenario of a 16-year-old who tells you that he's been having a really rough time. He's been missing more school because he's really tired and he's feeling down. He feels bad that he's falling behind in school, and he knows that his teachers are upset with him. He further confides that he has been having sex for extra money and a place to stay. He doesn't want you to tell anyone. So we have to think about this conversation that you're having and whether or not this is a mandatory report. So in this case, this is a mandatory report in the state of Iowa because minors cannot exchange sex for anything of value. And we have also removed that caregiver status as well, that we don't know who the perpetrator is in this circumstance, but it does not have to be a caregiver for the mandatory report to be made. So a second scenario that you may encounter is that you have a 15-year-old female and she tells you that she's been talking to this older guy over social media for the last several months. At first, he was really nice to her and helped her through some hard times. But recently, he began to ask for some seductive photos. She told him no because she didn't want to give him any photos, but then he started to threaten her and her family if she doesn't send them, and now she's pretty scared. So is this a mandatory report? And this one is a tough one. And here in the state of Iowa, minors cannot be solicited for commercial sex acts. And when you take a look at this situation, I think there is significant concern that grooming has been occurring and that the photos would actually be used for some form of commercial sex act. So this one is one that I think takes some very sensitive conversations with your patient, but would be likely a mandatory report. Thirdly, you have a 17-year-old who presents for concern of a sexual assault. After a trauma-informed discussion and evaluation, the individual tells you that their partner has been forcing them to have sex with numerous people over the last several months. She doesn't want anyone to know, but she just wants treatment for the sexually transmitted diseases that she may have encountered. Is this a mandatory report? So again, yes, this is concern for sex trafficking in Iowa as the individual has been forced into having sex with other individuals. Again, there is no caregiver status that comes up. And this caregiver status is important when we particularly think about adolescents, because within the healthcare field, they have been given more abilities to control the information when their sexual health is concerned. But here you have to remember, since there's no caregiver status and there is concern for forced sex with other people, you have to think about sex trafficking, and this would be considered a mandatory report. Lastly, here we have a 40-year-old who tells you that his employer has not been paying him for the last 3 months. He further explains that the conditions are pretty dangerous at work, and he's afraid that he might get hurt because there's never enough safety gear for everyone. Is this a mandatory report? No, he's an adult, so this is not a mandatory report situation. The other part that's important, as we talked about, that when you have concerning situations for abuse and exploitation, that you really should think about offering resources and how to do that best, and allowing the individual to guide you in what type of resources that they would like, or even if they want them at all at this time. You're, as Elise was kind of talking about, and Jessica, building that trust into the system. Perhaps they don't want it initially, but they may come back for resources at a later time. So lastly, to just kind of please know, always remember to think about the support and resources that you may give them, especially when you're in a situation. If there's an advocate that can be used, that can really be helpful in that situation. So don't forget about those resources, regardless if it's a mandatory report or not. So thank you for your time. I hope that gives you a little bit of information to just think about how mandatory reporting may come into place, especially since the child sex trafficking laws have been added to Iowa. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Findlay. Now, Teresa Davidson, Anti-Human Trafficking Coordinator for Mercy Medical Center in Cedar Rapids, will explain trauma-informed care, exploring the ways the brain changes and responds to trauma, and the 6 guiding principles to a trauma-informed approach. Teresa?
Thanks, Lori, and thanks, Shannon, and to all the other panelists. This is a fantastic summit, and I'm really happy to be here. So my name is Teresa Davidson, and I'm the co-founder and president of Chains Interrupted, which is a nonprofit fighting against human trafficking in Cedar Rapids and Eastern Iowa. I'm also a nurse practitioner and work as the Anti-Human Trafficking Coordinator at Mercy Medical Center in Cedar Rapids. So my talk today is on trauma-informed care. There are many definitions of trauma out there, but at its core, it's a deeply distressing or disturbing event or series of events that overwhelms an individual's ability to cope. It actually threatens their very well-being. There are different types of trauma: acute trauma, chronic trauma, and complex trauma. But for the purpose of the presentation today, I'm talking about complex trauma, which is basically an exposure to chronic trauma that is typically interpersonal and has a more severe impact on a person. Again, it's typically interpersonal, meaning it occurs between people. Usually this interpersonal nature is between a caregiver and a child, which is why it is such a significant betrayal and has such severe and persistent impacts. Complex trauma causes complex PTSD. They're pretty much one and the same. Complex PTSD can cause people to feel disconnected, even from their own bodies, have a disturbed body image, non-existent self-esteem, excessive shame, separation, isolation. This kind of trauma can actually result in schizophrenia. It can result in dissociative disorders. We used to call that multiple personality disorders. They can cause them to be a danger to themselves or even others. Unfortunately, trauma abounds in our society. However, even if people experience the same traumatic event, some will develop PTSD and some won't. In these stats from the Recovery Village, approximately 20% of people who experience trauma will go on to develop PTSD. These traumatic events are some of the most common trauma people experience that go on to develop PTSD. So a victim of an act of violence, they had their life threatened, victims of rape or sexual abuse. These are all things that most survivors of human trafficking report happened to them regularly. If we did a deeper dive into just one of these risk factors, it gives us a glimpse at the horror we are dealing with in human trafficking situation. Some survivors state the average number of buyers they had in one day was as many as 40, which would be over 14,000 rapes every year. So on this slide, it's a picture of the brain and the three most important areas that trauma really affects. And I kind of look at this as like if the amygdala is actually hyperactivated, and the amygdala is what I call the alarm center of the brain. It is the part of the brain that alerts us to danger. So it triggers that fight, flight, or freeze response. And remember, this is hyperactivated in a person who's experienced trauma. The hippocampus, I like to call the librarian. It's actually shrunk and hypoactivated. This librarian helps us to remember correctly. It tags our memories about when and where they occurred so that we can recognize if the event is happening now or if it happened to us in the past. The cortex is what I like to call the brakes of the brain. This area in the brain is also shrunk and slowed down and hypoactivated, and the brakes, the cortex, is actually where the reasoning and problem solving occurs in our brain. Social control in public places, our morals, goal setting, etc. These PET scans are physical evidence of how trauma, especially in early childhood while the brain is rapidly developing, can literally shut down certain areas of the brain. Look at the scan on the left. It's of a healthy brain and it shows active areas, which are red, yellow, and green, of the brain which regulate emotions and receive input from the senses. The scan on the right is a brain of an infant that underwent severe neglect. Black and purple areas represent severely decreased activity. People who have experienced trauma are at high risk for many more problems: alcoholism, drug use, depression, and especially disturbing, they are 15 times more likely to commit suicide than people who have not experienced trauma. There are two important things to take notice here. Many things on this list are vulnerabilities for being groomed into a trafficking situation. Like Elise had mentioned earlier, all of those vulnerabilities, they're here in this infographic. And two, having experienced a trafficking situation causes people to have trauma and thus are at risk for these issues. People that have experienced trauma behave in certain ways sometimes that can look like anger. It can look like uncooperation, etc. Some of the goals that they have to survive include pushing you away, to keep you from really knowing them, to be in control of everything possible, to be left unchallenged by social interactions. All of these goals come down to a sense of safety. They may be a little bit maladaptive, but they are actually helping that person survive. So it comes down to trauma-informed care. There are many definitions of trauma-informed care out there. I like the simple and straightforward one from ASCA, which is a strengths-based framework of thinking and interventions grounded in understanding of and responsiveness to the impact of trauma. So at its core, trauma-informed care is very simple. However, it can seem really complicated when researching it because there are quite a few definitions and different guiding principles out there. Just a simple Google search provides us with several different and confusing key principle guidelines. This one is from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration and includes 6 key principles. And here are just a few others. This one also includes 4 R's of trauma-informed care. This one adds the importance of recognizing the signs of trauma exposure and promoting evidence-based care. This one combines a few of those principles and adds a few others. Another confusing piece is research on trauma-informed care will discuss using these principles in regards to creating a trauma-informed care organization, treating a patient through a trauma-informed care lens, and then also treating the patient's trauma. So for the purpose of this presentation, I'll be discussing using trauma-informed care to treat a patient through a trauma-informed care lens. So now that we've discussed the complicated part of trauma-informed care, let's go down to the simple part. Trauma-informed care is simply a change of perspective. It's an understanding that everyone that we encounter may have been affected by trauma, and we change out the questions that we ask from what's wrong with you to what happened to you. As you can see, at its core, trauma-informed care knocks out any preconceived notion and judgment we may have and we may bring into the situation. Trauma-informed care acknowledges that a patient may be acting, that the way that they're acting may not be their fault. It acknowledges that their past experiences may be affecting their present behavior. It doesn't excuse the behavior, it just acknowledges the past experiences. I love this cartoon. It's funny, yet its message is so deep. We do not see the things as they are, we see things as we are. We truly need to check ourselves and the lens in which we are looking at our clients if we're truly going to help them. This is trauma-informed care at its core, a change of perspective. So I want to just read a case example and then apply some trauma-informed care principles to this. I'm going to talk about Susan. So Susan survived many sexual assaults by her stepfather from the age of 8 until she ran away from home at 15 years of age. In order to stay safe on the streets, she developed a relationship with a man she came to call her boyfriend, but in reality, she knew he was her pimp. Life was hard and she was beaten regularly. At the encouragement of her boyfriend, she started taking drugs to numb the pain. One day, she was brutally assaulted by a buyer and taken to the hospital by ambulance. As much as she hated the assault, she was actually hopeful that this might be her way out. She didn't know what she was experiencing was called trafficking, but she did know she didn't want to live the life she was living anymore. While waiting for the doctor to come in, she could hear the staff talking outside her room, calling her a prostitute. Susan got very angry and decided that they just wouldn't understand. She decided not to tell them anything. Not that it mattered, because no one asked. Shortly after, a nurse instructed her to disrobe and put on the thin hospital gown, open and back. A Caucasian male physician came in to do her exam, which included a vaginal speculum exam. He was all business, took one look at Susan's angry face, and didn't speak to her throughout the exam. He only spoke with the nurse to give her instructions on the samples he took and how to assist him as he stitched up Susan's multiple lacerations, including a stab wound on her inner thigh. The exam terrified Susan, and it was all she could do not to kick him in the face during her exam. The police were called, and Susan heard them talking with the physician outside her room. She heard the doctor tell them she was just a prostitute and that her sexual assault was from someone who had paid to get the experience he wanted. She heard the last comments he made to them, that he was tired of seeing young people waste their lives on drugs and alcohol. Then the nurse came in to give her a shot against STIs. She told Susan she had called her emergency contact and they were on their way to pick her up from the hospital. Susan's heart fell as she knew that she would not be receiving help from this hospital, and she would have a lot of explaining to do once River, the girl her boyfriend used to keep all his girls in line, got to the hospital. All right, let's apply some trauma-informed care principles to this case and see what could be possible. So understanding trauma and stress. I feel strongly that any model of trauma-informed care should include this at its very core. If the staff would have had an understanding of the effects trauma had on Susan's brain, they may have approached her attitude of anger and silence in a much better way. They may have understood that having a male physician do a vaginal exam on a female who had experienced multiple rapes was likely triggering to Susan, which made her amygdala, the alarm, fire danger, while her hippocampus, the librarian, couldn't recognize that the danger was in the past, not in the present. And her cortex, the brakes, had a hard time providing that Susan logic and control over her behavior. Safety. This principle deals with patients' needs to feel safe, both physically and psychologically, while in care of medical professionals. It encompasses everything from the physical room in which Susan underwent her exam to staff promoting a feeling of safety by addressing any concerns that she may have or triggers she may experience. The hospital staff should have asked some questions about the possibility of Susan being a victim of abuse or exploitation. In fact, Joint Commission requires that healthcare organizations protect patients by screening for and reporting abuse. At the very least, Susan should have had an advocate present with her during her exam, or the nurse could have acted as a liaison between Susan and the physician. Hospital staff called the trafficker's bottom bitch to come pick her up. The nurse should have created a safe discharge plan for Susan with Susan's input. Collaboration. Medical staff should view patients as partners in their effort to develop treatment plans. Patients need to be active participants in their healthcare decisions. The hospital staff should have been asking a lot more questions of Susan and providing her information about her exam and treatment. Empowerment. Patients who have experienced trauma need assistance in taking back control of their health. The staff should have effectively communicated options for Susan's treatment with her and enabled her to actively participate in determining her care. We should all try to notice people's capabilities versus their flaws. Sometimes they can be one and the same. The hospital staff could have noticed that Susan was resilient and strong enough to survive a brutal attack and encourage her in regards to that. Trustworthiness, transparency. When patients have suffered traumatic events such as human trafficking, it is very difficult for them to trust. Medical personnel need to be transparent with them and build a sense of trustworthiness. The staff should have told Susan what was happening, that the police were going to be called, and asked her who she wanted to be called. There are several other principles in trauma-informed care we could talk about here, but this is supposed to be just a brief overview today. And so in summary, I wanted to say that, we need to express that the patients, the people we're talking about are in control of what they share and what is done physically to them. Validate them in their strengths. Be sure to thank them for their courage, for disclosing, leaving their situation, whatever you can. And tell them that it was your honor that they shared this part of their recovery with you. We need to implement trauma-informed care in all of our organizations and with every person that we encounter, because you just never know who has experienced trauma. And I'll leave you with this. It's a thought from Mother Teresa. In this life, we cannot always do great things, but we can do small things with great love. Thank you.
Thank you, Teresa. We will now hear from a survivor and turned advocate, Heather Brown. Heather will talk about her 9 years of being controlled by an Iowa sex trafficking ring and what employers and community members can do to prevent human trafficking and slavery. Heather?
Thank you, Miss Lori. All right, so for 9 years, I was trafficked here in the state of Iowa and through the Midwest. For 9 years, I was bought and sold by men and women of all races, all social and economic statuses. The first thing that I can say is that every person on this call fits the description of a buyer or a pimp. Every person on this call fits the description of somebody who could be at risk of falling victim to human trafficking or a survivor of human trafficking. For 9 years, I was able to attend college, went to school, worked full time. For 9 years, I was able to still visit family, to have relationships, to friendships, yet I was trafficked. I will tell you that it wasn't until 2017 when I found someone who believed in me, that was willing to work with me, that what was happening to me was trafficking. I didn't have the verbiage. In 2008, when I went off to college for the first time, in my head, human trafficking only happened in third world countries. It was not something that was here in Iowa. It was until I met a man that I thought I was going to marry that took my freedom of having my money, took my freedom of my choice of when I was going to go visit family, when I was going to get to sleep at night, that I started to kind of learn that trafficking is here. In 2012, I was able to graduate from college with a degree in business, and I went on, into the work world, but yet my trafficking followed me. It wasn't done yet. So I went from college on to the job force, and again, I found myself being bought and sold through the night. I had people around me that I trusted. However, I will tell you that the pimps that controlled me used a lot of force, fraud, and coercion. I was microchipped and branded, tattooed in my genital areas. There were burns. I was cut if I didn't follow instructions. If I didn't show up for a transaction, they would use hand sanitizer on my belly and light it on fire. And then I was raped. The first transaction, or the first time that I was raped, or I guess it was their initiation into me, I was sold to 56 men and women in a 12-hour period. One after another came through the door. Sometimes there was more than one. At the end of that night, they made me count the money. It was just under $60,000. And he said, now every time, you get a phone call, every time I tell you to come, you better come. And I did. Every time I got a phone call, I went, for fear that they were going to hurt me, fear they were going to hurt my family. I was threatened multiple times with pictures of family members saying, if you don't go to this transaction, you're mine. People ask, you're a college student, how come you didn't reach out to your professors? How come you didn't reach out to, your parents? You couldn't. The fear that they're going to go and hurt my family, the fear of they're going to hurt me more if they know that I'm talking, keeps you there, keeps you just following whatever you have to do. It's really survival of the fittest, whatever is going to keep you alive, whatever is going to keep you going. The times that I did go to the doctor and I would hint that something was happening, they never really asked the questions. They never really pushed when I, kind of got really, there was one doctor, I remember one time going in and I was really jumpy every time he approached me. He goes, "What's wrong with you? I'm not going to hurt you. Calm down." And at that point I was like, nope, can't talk anymore. And I just left. In 2017, I was blessed enough to get connected finally to an advocate here in the state of Iowa that really changed my life. I sat down with her and I told her my story of where I was at, where I've been, and she didn't question. She didn't say that's not true. She didn't ask for proof. She didn't ask for all the specific details. She just listened and she validated to me that I was worthy enough and that someone was going to be there to listen to me and that she was going to stand beside me to get through this. It took about 2 years from 2017 to finally find my freedom. In that 2 years, I will tell you, I have had doctors question me when I say, I'm a survivor of human trafficking. They'll say, what do you mean you're a survivor of human trafficking? You just said you had a college degree. I have had receptionists at doctor's office when they come in and I'm a confidential patient ask, what does this mean? Why are you confidential? What's wrong with you? And I will tell you, when people say that, if you look around a waiting room, everybody just steps back. I will tell you that I am up against a lot of people who don't have very much trauma-informed care. There are a lot of people in our medical field that just, they don't understand the trauma side of human trafficking. They don't have the education and the verbiage of how to, properly support these survivors or, potential victims of human trafficking. I will also say in the community, I worked for a local grocery store for many years, and I even had a manager at one point when I was living in Omaha, Nebraska at the time, tell me that if I couldn't find a husband in Omaha, Nebraska, that I should probably give up dating, that I was not worthy of love, that there was nobody out there for me. Okay, I'm here to tell you that, employers don't always know the stories of their employees. He didn't know that I was being trafficked at the time, but what he told me hurt so bad that I felt like this is going to be my only chance of love, is if I stay with this pimp that tells me every day that he loves me. I will also tell you that the best form of fighting human trafficking is education. I lived with an excellent group of girls through college, and not a single one of them knew what was happening to me. I would come and go. When we would be out at the bars, I would randomly disappear and I'd show back up. And to them, oh, Heather's just drunk again. She'll be back. But the reality of it is I wasn't drunk. I was going to transactions. I would disappear late at night. I would become withdrawal. I'd be really short with people. I started drinking excessively. Even my professors, I had such a good repertoire with them that they didn't question when I didn't come to class, because I created that relationship with them, because I knew there are going to be days that I wasn't going to be able to make it to class. And now my friends, when I become withdrawn, they know to ask the questions. And that was through the education, through me talking to them about what I went through, showing them the red flags that we've talked about earlier in this presentation, and then implying them. And I'm not saying that we need to start hovering over everybody we know, and we need to start, go to your coworkers and be like, I need to know everything. I want to protect you. But what we do need to do is educate ourselves. So when a coworker starts acting weird, or a friend or a family member, are you brave enough to ask questions? And if you are brave enough to ask questions, are you strong enough to not judge? If someone comes up to you and says, I'm a survivor, I'm being trafficked, your reaction of what your face says is going to determine if I continue talking to you. Because you might not have to say a word, but I'm going to look in your eyes and I'm going to know if you're going to be a person that's going to stand beside me, or if you're going to be a person that's going to judge and not give me the help I need. And that all comes down to the trauma-informed care. How you interact with survivors and victims of human trafficking is huge. 3-4 years ago, I went to Methodist Hospital in Des Moines, Iowa for a rape kit. They took me to, at the time, it was kind of at like an old part of the building, and they took me up there and they left me there to wait for the SART nurse. I was probably in this room alone for 2 hours before the nurse showed up. She came and did her kit. I said I didn't know if I wanted to press charges. I didn't want to press charges, but she says, well, it's protocol. We have to bring in the law enforcement. A male officer came in, asked me a bunch of questions. She gave me some old clothes to put back on, said, we need to keep your clothes. Here's the information, here's a packet, and off I went. Never once was an advocate brought in. Never once was I heard when I said, I'm not ready to talk to law enforcement. And I will tell you, as a as a survivor, there have been times where I have spoke with law enforcement and I couldn't be honest. And people will be like, well, you lied to cops, you did this. But to me, it wasn't a lie. To me, it was my truth, because I've lived a life for so long, and I was told that I have to say certain things or people in my world are going to get hurt. And I will tell you that law enforcement, when you lie to them, it tends to be like, nope, we're done with you. You can't be honest. But the reality of it is, I don't know many survivors that aren't going to probably tell you a few lies, because we're going to have to build trust with you. And we're going to have to build that repertoire that we can one day go on and you're going to have our back. I have had officers that I have reported things to, and they come back and just say, well, that's probably just a scam. No big deal. But when is it not a scam? When are we going to take what, victims say seriously? And I will tell you that once you, it's out that you're a victim of sex trafficking, people look at you differently. People will judge you. They judge everything you say, everything you look, everything. I had a nurse one time that was like, well, you don't even look like someone who fits the characteristic of a trafficking victim. Well, like I said before, guys, there is no picture perfect example of what a victim looks like. We all fit that criteria. And I'm also here to tell you that your social economic status doesn't matter if you're going to be at risk. I grew up in a small community that I was very well known. I was very supported by my friends and family. I went off to a small private college, and yet here I am 10 years later, well, almost 20 years later, and this was my world. I will also tell you that the interactions that you have with, whether you're an advocate, whether you're a healthcare worker, your first interaction is going to determine if that person you're talking to is going to ever get them to where they need to go. I've had people, the first time I came out was in 2016 when I told someone that I was being trafficked, and she wanted the proof. And I showed her the scars. And guys, I don't have scars on my hands, on my face. I have scars hidden under my clothes, because these traffickers don't want to draw attention to themselves. So when people say, well, you're not all cut up, you're not all bruised, I am. But they're just places that nobody can see, because if they could see them, how are the traffickers going to continue to make their money? If we shine the light on it, and I went to class with bruises or cuts all over my face, people are going to start asking questions. So I can tell you now that, as you continue on your journey and as you continue to advocate for survivors and serve survivors, check yourself at the door. It's not our jobs to judge the people. It's our jobs to provide them hope and a light and direction, provide them resources where they can get help. And it's okay if you don't feel comfortable working with a survivor and you have someone approach you, it's okay to say, you know what, I'm going to get somebody that can really help you, and walk that person to the person that can help them. Know your resources in your community. Know who you can trust, who is going to take that survivor under their wing and is going to walk them through this journey. I will tell you, the farther I get out of away from that life and more into freedom, the harder it is. There are things today that were a lot harder on day one. There are things today that are a lot harder than a year ago. And yet, the farther I get out, the more freedom I have. But what people need to realize is with freedom, you have your PTSD, you have your setbacks, your triggers, your night terrors. Just because you're free doesn't mean you're really free. Your brain will always remembers. So as you're working with survivors, whether it's the first day or the 100th day, just remember that they still need you. You might work with a survivor today that in 5 years comes back to you and still needs support. So be prepared. I challenge everybody. Like I said, the most important thing that you guys can do is educate yourself. And it's not just going to one conference or listening to one training. Get involved, do research, go listen to survivors. There's books out there, there's stories out there. Volunteer, in a home where you can, get educated, because not every story is the same. Not every story is going to be easy to listen to. Not every story is going to be textbook. So I challenge every one of you to go educate 10 people. So once you're done with this webinar today, go educate 10. Thank you.
Heather, thank you so very much for sharing your story. I wish we could have given you more time. You are an inspiration. Thank you. Now we're going to go back to Senator Maggie Tinsman to talk to about legislation in Iowa. Maggie?
You're on mute, Maggie.
I'll say what I just said. Heather, you are a saint. You are marvelous in what you have just done. Thank you so very much. I never, ever could have done that. So I have great joy in listening to you. Now I'd like to spend a few minutes of our time just talking about the importance of specific human trafficking legislation in Iowa and how you can become involved in seeing that this legislation passes. First, a little background. When I served in the Iowa Senate, I sponsored a bill that made human trafficking a felony. There's no easy job, as all legislators did not even know what I was talking about. I did a lot of education beginning with the Senate, and one senator whom I asked to be a sponsor said, no, that wasn't important to his rural area. Still, the big case in 2005 was Williamsburg, Iowa, hardly urban. When I said to him that I didn't know he supported slavery, he said, I don't. And I said, well, then you better agree to be a sponsor of this bill. So he did. After leaving the legislature, I founded the program Braking Traffik, which is now being run and successfully expanded by Family Resources. And you just heard from Elise Harden, who really is making it a success. In 2005, the Network Against Human Trafficking was founded and is Iowa's first and only statewide volunteer organization devoted exclusively to ending human trafficking in all forms. The network has no employees, is primarily volunteer driven, and is Iowa's leading advocate for improving public policy and legislation. And over the years, the network has been successful in passing 23 bills, all of which earn bipartisan and usually unanimous support. I serve right now enthusiastically as the secretary of the network and am now the chair of the Legislative Advisory Committee of the Network of Human Trafficking. The network serves as Iowa's leading platform for collaboration and communication between anti-trafficking nonprofit organizations and Iowa's public agencies, including especially Department of Human Services, the Department of Public Safety, and the Governor's Office. It's been successful in carrying out a variety of programs, but most recently has campaigned for passage of over 20 local city ordinances to root out sex trafficking in illicit massage businesses, and the recent establishment of the Hotel Motel Employee Trafficking Awareness Training Project, which is a program that's currently being implemented. That is to say that all hotel motels are asked to train their employees about human trafficking, and most is forced prostitution that takes place in their hotels and motels, and some labor trafficking. If these establishments do the training, local, state, and federal government will utilize and pay these particular hotels for various activities that these governments hold in the hotels. But if no training has occurred, those hotels and motels will not receive governmental dollars for various activities. Now, I need your help in talking to Iowa legislators about 5 other issues that the network has delineated, and they are now on your screen. The network asked the legislature to adopt a safe harbor law to eliminate charging minors or commercially sex exploited individuals with prostitution and minor labor trafficking victims with crimes committed during the course of their exploitation. Second, the network asked the legislature to pass a law for expungement of crimes committed by human trafficking survivors which occurred while they were trafficked. Third is the network is asking the legislature to request schools to provide employees, parents, and guardians training, support, awareness, and prevention of child sexual harassment, exploitation, or abuse. Pre-K-12 age appropriate teaching needs to be done so that children can recognize child abuse and human trafficking with instruction to tell a trusted adult if it's needed. Fourth is the network asks that either the Iowa Supreme Court adopt rules or the Iowa legislature will enact legislation to include extending the rape shield protection to human trafficking victims in the rape shield law. That is, if they're going to court, that they will be shielded by the rape shield law. And the fifth one is the network requests the legislature pass legislation for uniform local law enforcement authority regarding massage businesses that would expand rather than limit local control. Yes, we have 20 massage ordinances. We need them all over the state. So you could distribute this list of 5 priorities, plus the Victim Assistance Fund for Survivors, which is what we need, that's in the Attorney General's office, to your legislators. Or you could select one particular priority that you like and talk to him or her about sponsoring a bill that would address that particular issue. And I can put you in touch with our legislative advocate, Angela Davis, who can advise you further with specific details. I think her email has just been shared with you all earlier at this presentation. But the main thing I wish to say to you is you are important. Please help us stamp out human trafficking now. Thank you.
Thank you, Maggie. We now will go to a few questions. I'm sorry, our time is limited, but my colleague Laura Anderson will ask questions of our panelists. Laura?
So we had quite a few questions. I don't think we're going to be able to get to all of them, but there were a few that stuck out as especially interesting. One person asked, for those working with survivors regularly, are you still seeing tattoos and branding? I've heard mixed messages on this. Can you elaborate on what you see specifically in Iowa? Is there anyone in particular that would like to address that question?
This is Elise. I can. We are still seeing tattoos and brandings, and similar to what Heather had said, that some are now disguised in areas in which we can't see. It's under the clothing, but in genital areas that's popular, and in the mouth. But usually tattoos of certain symbols or their pimp or manager's name or boyfriend's name. So that's kind of what we've seen in at least at Braking Traffik.
Great, thank you. Another participant asked, does the national hotline connect a caller to a service provider here in Iowa?
I'll take that one. The national network does have a directory of programs who sign up for it. So if you're a program serving sex or labor trafficking victims, I do encourage you to go to their website and get registered as a program so that you show up in their directory. I believe they have a map where you can type in zip code and see the nearest program. But what the Iowa Victim Service Call Center can just do a more detailed job on is we are familiar with each program across the state. We have internal phone numbers that maybe aren't public that we can get a hold of directors, staff members in these, and we know their ins and outs. So how do you qualify, or maybe what's their intake process? Are they a religious facility, which is an important aspect to go over with somebody? Maybe that works for them, maybe it doesn't. Are they an emergency facility? Does it take 30 days to get in? And so the national hotline does have those referrals, but I would say that our Iowa hotline could give you a little bit more detail, as well as find a program that really is a good fit for you.
Great, thank you, Jessica. We have another question. Is this info available to high school and junior high school staff and students all over Iowa, or just in select communities? Is there someone that could address some of the efforts that are being made to reach out to students directly via schools and other institutions?
I can take that and speak on behalf at least of what Braking Traffik is doing. Since we're in Davenport, Iowa, we serve 5 counties, which include Jackson, Clinton, Muscatine, Louisa, and Scott counties. And then of course we serve Illinois, but in Iowa, we have partnered with the Set Me Free project out of Omaha, Nebraska. And we are available to go into the schools and train students from elementary school on up, and then parents and teachers on human trafficking and social media safety through their Ready to Stand curriculum. So yes, it's available to all students. And if you are to get connected with any kind of victim service provider, I'm sure they do the same work in the schools as well, maybe with a different curriculum.
Great, thank you.
And Laura, I was also going to add to that just real quick. There are several different organizations that would present in schools, like Elise had mentioned, and Chains Interrupted also does that. But in light of COVID, with a lot of times we can't get into the schools to do it personally, we've also created a video, 2 videos, in fact. One is for school staff, which talks about, you know, how to recognize in your student groups, as well as what to do about it should you see that happen, and also a video for students themselves to recognize it amongst themselves and then in their peers, and what to do about it, because it is a little bit different. So we do have those videos available as well.
Great, this is all very important work, as we've obviously seen.
I'd like to say Braking Traffik, and this is an old, we went into the schools way before we went with Family Resources, and we produced a 15-minute video, and it's still fairly, you know, current, and it has 3 victims who talk about their situation. One was from the Quad Cities, one was from Dubuque, one was from the Waterloo, Cedar Falls area. And it's called Any Kid Anywhere. And when you went into the schools, once you showed, at least here in the whole Quad City area, when you showed that these were people from here, Iowa, this wasn't Bangladesh, this wasn't China, this was here. And that first person that I heard about in Williamsburg, Iowa, was a 13-year-old American girl kidnapped from Minneapolis, brought to a sex club in Williamsburg, Iowa. So it's good to show people that with these videos that people have, that yes, it's here, and these are the people who have been involved.
And to add to that, Any Kid Anywhere can be accessed by anybody anywhere. If you want to Google it and just put Any Kid Anywhere, and it should be the first link that pops up. It's available on Vimeo.
Oh, good. Good.
Great, thank you. I do see some other folks sharing resources in the chat if people want to check those out. And then we did have an interesting question during Shannon's presentation. Someone asked, who are mandatory reporters? Citizens, public?
Yeah, so thanks for that question, and sorry if I wasn't very clear. So the mandatory reporters are people who are often in certain professions. So when you are starting a new job in your work description, you'll be told if you're a mandatory reporter, but typically people who are in healthcare are mandatory reporters. Teachers, people with law enforcement are some of the, I think, most readily available examples of people who are mandatory reporters. Oftentimes in some of the community agencies, they do have the benefit where they can assist survivors without being a mandatory reporter. So often there's a different type of relationship. And so you just have to be very clear in understanding what your role is in your work environment as a mandatory reporter. For community members, you still have the opportunity to do a permissive report. Now, this is something that I think you have to really take into consideration what's occurring, because as we've mentioned here, we don't want to go into that rescue mentality. We really want to make sure that our goal is getting people connected to the support services that they need and how to do that appropriately. I hope that kind of answers your question as well. There was also kind of one question just to tail in on the dependent adults. So a dependent adult for both Iowa and Illinois, there's no specific law stating human trafficking into the definition. So you still should abide by dependent adult abuse, typical mandatory reports.
Great. Thank you very much. We are running out of time. There's been a lot of great questions. Really appreciate everyone's input. We do need to turn it back over to Lori to wrap things up.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you so much to all of our panelists. I don't know that there's a way, and we're going to try to see if we can send those questions to specific panelists and see if there's a way for them to answer them. There's also a concern and a question about if we could share the PowerPoints from our panelists. So there should be a way to do that too. All of you who have attended today will receive the recording. So of course, those PowerPoints will be on the recording, but we'll see if we can also send you the panel link in the information that you'll receive following this presentation. I just really want to thank our sponsors today, the Iowa Network Against Human Trafficking and the Franciscan Peace Center. Their links to their websites will be found in the chat. And of course, I want to thank our esteemed panelists, Dr. Findlay, Jessica Rohrs, Elise Harden, Teresa Davidson, Maggie Tinsman, and Heather Brown. I just cannot thank you all enough for everything that you shared today. And Heather, you truly are an inspiration and your courage is just amazing. Thank you so much. I also want to thank the people who helped with the marketing technology, Lori Palmer, Cynthia Forsythe, Christy Gale, Amanda Eberhardt, Shelley Seifert, and Laura Anderson. So please look in the chat box for some other upcoming events. Thursday the 14th, the governor will sign a proclamation designating January as Slavery and Human Trafficking Awareness Month, Human Trafficking Prevention Month. That is the 14th at 11 a.m. and you are all invited to join us virtually. And then also in the chat room is an information on January 28th. There's Race Matters, Confronting the Roots of Human Trafficking. This is a virtual event from 6 to 8 p.m. where Luana Nelson Brown and MESH will discuss ending the demand for human trafficking through the lens of racial justice. So I hope you'll attend that as well. Again, thank you to everyone. Thank you to all of our attendees. We had 156 attend live today and total of 250 that will also receive the recording. So thank you. And I pray that 2021 is a year where we will see even more great strides to end human trafficking. We must all do our part. Thank you very much.